And thank you for joining us. My name is Chip Gibbons. I'm the Policy Director for Defending Rights Dissent. I want to thank you for joining this webinar, which is a joint webinar of not only Defending Rights Dissent, but, and I'm going to have to read the full list of organizers. We have so many great ones. Greenpeace, the National Lawyers Guild, Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University School of Law, Uncoke My Campus, Piper Fund, Common Cause, Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, Palestine Legal, BlackOUT Collective, and PEN America. The topic of tonight's webinar is organizing protests in a socially responsible way during COVID. As we know with COVID, many of us, I suspect all of us, are concerned about preventing the spread of the disease. And as a result, we've been taking necessary precautions. We've been practicing social distancing. If possible, we've been staying in place. But unfortunately, we know that the social injustice hasn't gone away or hasn't just gone into lockdown during this time. The causes we care about, whether they're war and militarism, environmental degradation, rights of working people, racial justice and opposing state violence and white supremacy, and many other good causes still need us. And this has unfortunately been particularly made timely by the fact that earlier in this week, George Floyd was murdered by police in Minneapolis. He was 46 years old. And last night, when people gathered in Minneapolis to protest his murder, we saw, as is all too common, police attacking protests, people protesting the murder of unarmed Black people with tear gas, rubber bullets. So we still have to fight for justice, even though we are in lockdown. And in a lot of ways, COVID has created new calls for protest. We know this with people who are protesting for decarceration and to save people from jails and immigration detention centers that are hotbeds of social spread. We know this with people who are fighting for labor rights, for people whose employers are putting their own profit over the safety of their workers. And we know this from people who are fighting to cancel the rent and stay evictions. So there's a lot of organizing to still be done. So how do we do it in a socially responsible way? Our webinar tonight has a three-part structure. Part one, we will discuss the legal landscape and what your rights are. This part will be led by Mara Verheyden-Hilliard, the co-founder of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, and Nick Robinson, the legal advisor for the International Center for Nonprofit Law. In part two, we're going to turn to activists and organizers who will have a conversation with each other on the challenges of organizing during COVID. We are extremely privileged tonight to be joined by Chinyere Tutashinda, co-director of the BlackOUT Collective, Tyler Crawford, Mass Defense Coordinator at the National Lawyers Guild, NeeNee Taylor, the core organizer for Black Lives Matter DC, Sean Blackmon, the DC organizer for the Party of Socialism and Liberation, and Medea Benjamin of Code Pink. And then part three is you. That's right. We're going to be taking questions from the audience. If you're watching this on YouTube or on our website, there is a way to type in the questions. And our website is rightsanddissent.org. And someone will be bringing them to me. So without further delay, let's start with Nick and Mara. Nick and Mara?
I believe Nick is going to start.
Okay. Nick, you're currently muted.
Yeah, I'm muted and my video is blocked, but I can just start talking. Oh, I can start my video. Here we go. Sorry, it just took a minute.
Muted and neither seen nor heard is not the way we like panelists.
Thanks for having me. You know, as you mentioned, I'm a legal advisor at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. You know, we work in the US and around the world to create a legal environment that's supportive for activists and nonprofits. I'm really pleased to be joining everyone here on this panel tonight, and looking forward to learning a lot, you know, from my co-panelists and everybody who's joining us remotely. So I was going to begin by just spending some time describing the confusion over protests in the COVID-19 era from a legal perspective, where we've ended up seeing some protests shut down by law enforcement or protesters fined or arrested. We've also seen some demonstrations go forward largely without any incident. Mara is then going to lay out more clearly what protesters' rights are during this period and what kind of legal issues to think through when organizing a protest during this kind of COVID-19 era. So, I think from a legal perspective, the confusion we have seen fundamentally comes down to, on the one hand, you have these stay-at-home orders and restrictions on gathering that have been worded in this, very overbroad, unclear manner. And then on the other hand, we have the First Amendment, which does not go away. It allows for restrictions on freedom of assembly, but only if they're narrowly tailored to further a compelling government interest. And since the First Amendment isn't specific about what restrictions you can have in a pandemic, this has led to some confusion and some room for abuse. So about 45 states ended up having full or partial stay-at-home orders at the height of the restrictions in late April, early May. These were issued generally through executive orders. Many of them banned gatherings for any purpose outside of essential activities. Today, we have a situation where almost all states now have at least partially lifted their stay-at-home orders, but they almost all have restrictions on gathering. So whether that's a certain size of a gathering or maintaining physical distancing, and very few states have explicit carve-outs or guidance for protests in their executive orders. Although many states do have carve-outs or guidance for religious gatherings, which I think Mara is going to touch on more, kind of the implications of that later. So these restrictions on gathering have created a number of problems. So, just like consider New York, where there's a well-known example of this, where, until recently there was stay-at-home orders that banned gatherings of any type in New York City, but allowed people to be out 6 feet apart. There were multiple protests that were shut down by the New York City police, even when people were socially distanced. So, for example, the Reclaim Pride protest at Mount Sinai Hospital, in response to shutting down that protest, actually, the New York City Police Commissioner said that while the city, quote, greatly respects the right of people to protest, there should not be protests taking place in the middle of a pandemic by gathering outside and putting people at risk, unquote. So in other words, he said there was this kind of blanket ban on demonstrations outside. Yet critics, noted that, there had been protests by healthcare workers in New York City demanding more protective gear, and those protests weren't shut down. There had been reopened protests at the state capitol in Albany, and those protests went forward. Now in New York State, just last week, you have an order that you can have gatherings of up to 10 people, but it's not clear in the executive order how authorities will treat protests, say of over 10 people, even if it's physically distanced. Or consider another example, which is California, where there's similar kinds of confusion. There had been restrictions on any gatherings in the state as well, but there were also numerous protests over the last month or so in California. Some of those led to arrests, some of those led to threatened arrests, others of those led to no arrests at all, and the protests went forward. And the government also did this kind of broad, indefinite ban on protests at all state facilities, including the state capitol. Or just one last example here to kind of give you this picture. In North Carolina back in April, while they were still under stay-at-home order, the police broke up a protest, and then they tweeted after that protest is a quote-unquote non-essential activity. So again, quite severe restriction. Now things have changed in North Carolina. So now in North Carolina, you can have gatherings of up to 25 people outside. And actually in their executive order, they have an exemption for all First Amendment activity now, and they simply urge that organizers promote physical distancing. So, kind of to summarize here, I think what we're seeing right now is this very fluid situation where restrictions keep changing. Right now, they tend to be loosening. The restrictions differ considerably between jurisdictions, and enforcement of similar restrictions can be quite varied. And then another thing to keep in mind is that although restrictions are easing now, we might see another wave or peak of COVID-19 in the summer or fall, where you could see the reimposition of stricter restrictions. And if you're interested in learning more about the restrictions in your jurisdictions, you might check out actually a number of this website at communityresourcehub.org, which has COVID-19 policing. And a number of that site's partners include a number of groups co-sponsoring today, I noticed. And I think that's a good place to begin, but it's also important to keep in mind that it's difficult to keep everything up to date and make it comprehensive. So I'd suggest, also doing your own research and looking not only at what are the state orders in your jurisdiction, but also kind of county and municipal, because those can often be more restrictive than the state orders themselves. And looking through the executive orders, or even doing something simple like Googling restrictions on gathering in the place that you live. And so, I think while this period is fairly fluid, there's some core legal principles you can keep in mind that will allow you to organize protests in the safest possible way from a legal perspective. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mara, who's going to discuss more specifically some of the things you might want to think about when you're planning a protest.
Mara? I think you're muted. You're muted.
Okay, I was unmuting, but the host was controlling my mute.
That sounds tyrannical. I am not the host on this one, so I can say that.
In any case, I'm Mara Verheyden-Hilliard. I'm a constitutional rights lawyer. I'm the co-founder of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund. And I want to thank everyone who's joining us this evening, who's tuning in around the country, who's been in the streets, who's been in their cars, who have been organizing protests, attending protests. And I want to thank all the organizations in the Protect Dissent Network, because it's been a really powerful group of people and organizations from many different sectors coming together, defending free speech rights, and all of those who came together to make this event happen. It's been really excellent working together. But I want to actually start by talking a little bit about our title. Our title was Organizing Socially Responsible Protests. And the reason that we chose that was 2 weeks ago, when we were coming together and discussing having this event, we were talking about this really in the context of where we were at that moment 2 weeks ago. And of course, protesting in the time of COVID has been really dynamic. I mean, my organization, the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, has been working with organizers and activists all over the country who have been coming out, who've been organizing demonstrations, who have been at the jails demanding decarceration, demanding that the American prison system is not sentencing the incarcerated to death by COVID, with people who are going to ICE detention centers, where similarly the government is basically just forcing people into contagion and death, to folks that have been out demanding cancel the rents, because a moratorium on rent means nothing when 3 months of rent are coming due and you still don't have any money, with healthcare workers who are out in the demanding that they have PPE, that they have protections. And at the same time that we're seeing all these progressive protests, we've been seeing, of course, the ultra-right protests, which have really dominated, I think, the public sphere, which have really dominated what the media is covering. They're choosing to cover those more than they're covering the progressive social justice and racial justice protests. You have limited coverage of the folks who came out after the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And again, we're seeing this right-wing dynamic. And so when we were organizing this, we were really trying to make that distinction about folks who are protesting, who also want to protect public health, who are not turning against public health protections, who want to protect themselves and their society. And that's why we have this title. But I want to say at this moment, there's a sharp demarcation. And there is a sharp demarcation and a change in the lay of the land and a change in the nature of protest, and it's dynamic and it's continuing to be dynamic. And we are at a new stage. We're at a new stage that has been brought on and brought forward by the vicious, gruesome, racist police slow motion lynching of George Floyd. And there are thousands of people who've been in the streets in Minneapolis yesterday who are being attacked with rubber bullets, who are being shot with tear gas. People are coming out now. While we're talking, there are people who are out in the streets who are coming out. And, you know, I think we all understand the police repression against them isn't because there's a failure of social distancing. That's not the police's concern. They're attacking the demonstrators because the demonstrators are standing up for justice and are insisting that once again, when the police kill someone and they kill someone in broad daylight, anyone else does that, you're arrested. When the police do it, what do we see? We see the whole system turn on its head to try and exonerate them first and rarely arrest them and maybe mildly prosecute them and virtually never convict them. And the people of the United States and people fighting for racial justice can't tolerate that. And we can't expect that there's going to be some extra practiced social distancing. I know people are trying to be safe and people are trying to protect themselves and to protect each other. But I want to be clear that in our presentations and what our thinking is for this protest, it's not telling people how to protest. It's trying to help people assert their rights, know what to look for and how the government and the police are seeking to suppress demonstrations, and to give us all the tools and the power that we can get working together collectively to fight for our rights to be in the street. And I would say right now, actually, it's socially irresponsible not to protest. I mean, you only have to look at the front page of the New York Times to see what we know, that millions of children in America are hungry, that there is going to be what they refer to as an avalanche of evictions. And what are people going to do? People are demonstrating because it's a matter of life, of death, of food, of housing. That's where we're at. And everyone actually should be figuring out how they can be organizing with a group, how they can be preparing to demonstrate, how they can do so safely and protect themselves. So we need to talk about our right to protest in that perspective, because it's an imperative right now that I think maybe more imperative as we're reaching this stage of what's happening in our country, maybe more than any other point in some of our lives. So with that perspective, I want to talk about what Nick was saying in terms of, as he was laying out the restrictions and the obstacles and many of the problems that we're facing in terms of people's ability to access the streets, in terms of people's ability to be in their cars, in terms of people's ability to actually have careful, protected, socially distant protests and to speak their minds and to be out there. Because what we also know right now is while the country paused in some way in a haphazard, unstructured, and very piecemeal manner, the country is reopening in a similar haphazard, piecemeal, unstructured manner. And because of the chaos of all of this, we also know that those who seek to suppress the social justice movement, those who wish to run right through the powerful movement for climate justice, all of those entities, and certainly hasn't slowed the police from police murders. All of those entities are moving full speed ahead. They're not pausing. In Louisiana, the legislature has just passed a bill that actually makes their critical infrastructure law, creates a mandatory minimum of 3 years in jail for nonviolent trespass offenses in a state of emergency, like we have right now with COVID. We see in other legislatures that they're going forward passing anti-BDS laws to be able to stop people and punish people who wish to simply exercise their constitutional right to free speech, to have opinions on justice for the Palestinian people. We can see, we had the minister from Alberta, the resource minister there, actually, the energy minister, publicly state in Canada that this was a great time to be pushing forward with pipelines because the restrictions on protest under COVID limit protesters to 15 or less. And so they should take advantage of that to ram through pipelines so that they won't have to deal with the powerful movement of indigenous people and supporters and justice activists who have stood there and stood in defense of their water, of land, of health of our society. So COVID is unquestionably being used as a pretext. It's being used to suppress dissent. And we can see this sort of scattershot approach of when people are being shut down for organizing or for protesting, when they're being fined, when they're not being fined. The randomness makes it very difficult for people. And for example, in some states, there's authorization for, as Nick was saying, for churches to exercise their First Amendment rights. But simultaneously, if you want to express dissent, a fundamental First Amendment right, that's not allowed. These are the areas where there are fundamental constitutional ground rules. And these are the areas where the challenges can be had and where people need to think about it in terms of what they can and can't do. Because also, as people have talked about and others will talk about, there isn't a clear roadmap. We don't have clarity from the government or about what they think you can or can't do. They're putting out these very irregular rules and regulations. Many of them are constitutionally unsound and constitutionally impermissible. For example, when Cuomo was saying that he was lifting restrictions on assembly for Memorial Day, but keeping restrictions on protests, when other areas are saying that you can't engage in free speech activities in certain numbers, but yet you can go out recreationally. So that's an area that I want to start to talk about in terms of thinking through in your own jurisdiction. For anyone that's organizing or planning to organize, you should absolutely go and look at what is your shelter-in-place order, what's your stay-at-home order, what does it allow, what does it disallow? And then you want to look at it in terms of our own basic sense of, like, does that seem right? Does that seem fair? That's the fundamental premise from which we form the constitutional challenges, which is, if they're saying to you, you can't protest, well, you can't actually have a blanket ban on protests. The First Amendment is not repealed in a state of emergency. You can't tell people that you can't express your point of view. Now, government can say to people that there's time, place, manner restrictions, that there are public health measures in place, and we're in agreement that there are crucial public health issues right now, and that we want to keep people safe. But those have to be fairly applied. They can't just be applied to protesters, to free speech, or even more so, to some protesters and not others, because we certainly saw right-wing protesters screaming in the face of health advocates. We've seen them marching on the Capitol, some with swastikas and nooses, fully armed, and yet when people are out last night and now demanding justice for George Floyd, they're met with tear gas and with rubber bullets. So when you're looking at the question of what's allowed, what's not allowed, you want to think about what's the differentiation. If your jurisdiction, as it's opening up, allows you to go outside, then you can go outside in whatever number is allowed with other people, with social distancing, and express a point of view. If, for example, people can be in a public park, so long as they're socially distant and not grouped in non-social distant ways, if they can be out there for recreational purposes, which many of these orders state, they say, well, you can play tennis, or California says you can do yoga and watch the sunset and the sunrise. Well, we can watch the sunset and the sunrise and the sun over our heads and be chanting and speaking and saying what is in our minds and coming together in collective action. We can do all of those things. It's true too, for example, the issue of car protests. People who have been organizing these amazing car protests And they've been happening all over the country. When you're in your car and you're protesting, your rules are the same as any other rule when people are in their cars. Now, in some circumstances, and in fact, we dealt with this in DC, the police, and here we had an issue with Trump's National Park Service, tried to tell organizers that they couldn't assemble where they were meeting up in a parking lot in their cars, socially distant, because that number of people in that parking lot would violate permitting rules. So we had to intervene and explain that there were other people in the parking lot and they were all in their cars and they were going to be there to go use the recreational grounds because it was a parking lot outside a big park, and that they couldn't punish people. They were threatening them that it was an illegal assembly simply because they were there with the intention to then drive off and engage in a socially responsible car protest. And similarly, we have that issue with honking. You should look at your jurisdiction and figure out or ask, if you can, whether or not there are restrictions on honking. Because if the police are trying to target a progressive demonstration, they may target people for excessive honking. But then note, when there are parades or celebrations or things that we're seeing all the time for people's graduations, for their birthdays, to support healthcare workers and first responders, there's a lot of honking. Those folks are not getting cited. So if the police are selectively citing organizers, progressive organizers for honking, that's an area. Same thing for like using hazard lights. Then you also have this other dynamic that's happening where courts are accepting, and they did this in California with a terrible ruling earlier this month, the government's untested assertions about what may be necessary in a pandemic. And again, we're not challenging that there is the right of a government to put in place public health measures. There should be public health measures. But we do challenge the right of a government to use public health measures as a pretext, or to do so so broadly that it's infringing on First Amendment rights in a way that is not narrowly tailored and is not necessary for public health. So again, a blanket ban on protest and demonstration would fall into that area. And in California, there was a lawsuit brought by people that wanted to organize a demonstration. They were in the right-wing Open the Government protest. And while we may have no sympathy for what their underlying message was, the ruling was a very bad ruling, and I think wrongly decided. Because the judges in that case said that it isn't up to the court to question what the government says is necessary in terms of public health. That's not true. That's the same excuse that we have contended with for decades when the government comes in and says that they're going to restrict social justice protests or anti-war protests because it's a threat to national security. Time and time again, we've had to go before the courts and demand and show that the measures are not tailored to national security, that the measures are tailored to suppress dissent. And it's the same thing when we're talking about protesting in the age of a pandemic. Courts cannot accept these blanket, untested assertions. And there would have been other reasons, perhaps, for those planned protests. They want to have food trucks, they want to hand out literature, they want to do a lot of things that would be questionable with a public health interest. But this other ruling was very dangerous. And I think as progressive people and people that are fighting for social justice and civil rights and free speech rights, we have to be very, very mindful of what also happens in these other venues. So for example, Facebook was taking down postings for Open the Government protests. And again, we don't have to have sympathy for what those protests are, but we sure have to be worried about Facebook taking down people putting up information about protests. And specifically, Facebook said that it was working with local government authorities and law enforcement in making those decisions. We can't support that. None of us can support that, no matter what the issue is. So I want to wrap up because we're going to have a lot of time for question and answer later, and people should put their questions into the chat, and a lot of the questions will be read and we'll be able to answer them. And I want to be able to respond to people based on the things that you're really contending with and what the current issues are. But again, I just want to say how amazing and great it is that so many people are participating in this, that so many people are standing up, that are finding ways to express ourselves. I mean, the pipelines, they're going forward. The police killings, they're going forward. Millions of people are going to be without food and without housing and without health care. We have a situation now where all of us have to make a difference, and we have to find the way to come together to do this and to overcome all of our obstacles, because on the other end of this, what society looks like is going to be very different than what it looked like last year and what it looks like right now. And the way that it looks could be an incredible shift in the world based on what we do and based on our making sure that that outcome and that change is the one that we desire. We can't leave it to other people to make those calculations and to make those decisions and to make that happen. It's up to us.
Thank you very much, Mar. That was an excellent presentation, and it gave us a lot to think about. So I've been doing enough of these since COVID that I've learned that people like it when I periodically reintroduce the panelists, just in case people joined late or forgot. So we just heard from Mar Verheyden-Hilliard, co-founder of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, and Nick Robinson, legal advisor for the International Center for Nonprofit Law. That segment was on knowing your rights and what's the current legal landscape for protesting. Later, we're going to go to questions from the audience, but first, we're going to hear from activists and organizers who have been organizing during COVID and what challenges they faced and how they've organized socially responsible protest. This segment features Chinyere Tutashinda, co-director of BlackOUT Collective, Tyler Crawford, the Mass Defense Coordinator at the National Lawyers Guild, NeeNee Taylor, the core organizer for Black Lives Matter, Sean Blackmon, the DC organizer for the Party of Socialism and Liberation, and Medea Benjamin of Code Pink, who many of you might know from her very creative protest. Thank you for joining us all. I'm hoping that this segment will work more as a conversation amongst you than me talking. I think the less the audience hears from me, the better off we all are. So I'm going to dive right into my first question. As I mentioned earlier, and as Mara talked about, last night people gathered in Minneapolis to protest the police murder of George Floyd. These protesters are met with police violence, including the use of tear gas and rubber bullets. Unfortunately, we know that social injustices like white supremacy and state violence are not going into lockdown during the pandemic. As a result, it is still necessary for us to continue to organize against injustice and for a better world. As organizers and activists, what difficulties have you faced organizing during the pandemic, and how have you continued organizing in spite of them? Sean, you're nodding your head, so that to me is volunteering to go first.
Well, certainly. Well, thank you so much, Chip Gibbons. It's good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you again, too.
All the organizations in this coalition that put on this event this evening. I think it's so important that we have these conversations. And in answering the question you put forth, it's a good one. And I think it's important to tie this all together, because when we talk about state-sanctioned violence, that's deeper than a cop, pulling his gun and shooting you, or pulling out a baton or a taser and beating you or shocking you. This systemic violence that we've seen intensify and be exacerbated under the coronavirus vaccine, to put it lightly, has been intense, right? And these things are connected. The racist police terror that we've seen carried out against Mr. Floyd up in Minneapolis and all these other places, there's a connection to this. And the issue of housing and food and all of this. Because if we look at the role of the police in our society, in our social, political, and economic order, when they say that they're here to serve and protect, they're telling the truth. But what they're serving are the interests of the ruling class, and what they're protecting is their property. The mistake is ours when we begin to think that the role is to protect us. There was no protection for Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis. There was no protection for Breonna Taylor, an EMT up in Louisville. There wasn't protection for her partner, Kenneth Walker, who the police tried to charge with attempted murder for firing at people who he thought were burglarizing their home. Luckily, those charges were dropped. There was no protection for Sean Reed in Indianapolis when police stood over his dead body and mocked him. This is the depth of the cruelty and brutality and inhumanity of the police as an institution. We should never make the mistake of individualizing these incidents. The individual officer, it makes no difference, because when they put that uniform on, they are immediately a part of a culture of impunity that gives them the power over life and death. And that is why I think we see so much as we continue to see. And in terms of difficulty for organizing, we had our first Cancel the Rent event. I want to say that was April 25th. Correct me if I'm wrong, or somebody else was there. I believe it was April 25th. And that was 45 cities and towns across the United States. So a part of the issue, right, is making it clear to people not only why we're doing what we're doing, but how we're going to do it, to differentiate ourselves from those reactionary and right-wing, anti-lockdown protests, where they're all jammed up together. Maybe a handful of people are wearing masks and gloves. In the first place, if we were outside of our cars, we were doing the standard 6 feet apart. We even provided gloves for people who needed them. And we were very clear and orderly about how the thing was going to take place. And see, the reason why this is important is because we are in a time where things are rapidly changing. We are in a dynamic time, and that requires that we be dynamic with it. We have to seize the time. We cannot shrink back. It'd be so easy to give in to that fear of so many things, which is well placed, and we should acknowledge that. There are some things that are legitimately scary happening, but we must remind folks, and the people of Minneapolis have shown us this in a strong way. I mean, they came out in throngs, thousands of people coming out to protest the racist police terror against Mr. Floyd. And what were they met with? Repression. You see what I mean? And so, it's been spoken about a little bit already this evening about these legal measures to try to roll back protest rights. And it's so important that we push back against this, because the way I see these things as attempts to, sow the seeds of frustration and doubt and disaffection to try to basically keep us where we are, to make sure that we're stuck, not only, physically in terms of quarantine, but in terms of being stuck in a sense of helplessness and feeling like there's nothing that we could do. Because when we look at the ongoing issue of racist police terror, the reality that many people will be evicted come the first. 12.7 million workers are now without health care. And those are individuals. When you factor in families and all of this, we're talking about much, much more. These are the sorts of things that, sow those seeds of fear and panic and things like that. This is what these officials in the state is trying to do. But we know that when you sow the wind, you get the whirlwind. And that whirlwind is us, that resistance to this violence and to our conditions. And for me, at least, the sorrow of our moment is counterbalanced by the joy of struggle itself. This is what is important for us to make people understand. We can still resist. We just have to be creative. Even though we're physically distancing, we are yet showing social solidarity. And what has been the government response to all of this? I mean, the two capitalist parties in this country, the Democrats and Republicans, they have seen fit to cast their lot with the banks and the bosses and the corporations. That's who they're bailing out, the folks who got enough money to last. Not the millions, not the tens of millions of folks who just don't know what they're going to do when the first comes. So that is why it is so important that we continue to find these ways to demonstrate and things like that. That is why this weekend we're having another car caravan, this time with 70 cities and towns. And people can see more about that at canceltherent.org.
Thank you, Sean. That was really, really very powerful. It reminds me of a quote I actually came across when I was reading on Sunday from Roger Baldwin, who is probably one of the most famous civil libertarians of the 20th century. He founded the ACLU. I thought this quote was very interesting. It said, "Civil liberties like democracy are only useful as tools for social change." So the right to protest is very clearly very linked to our right to build the type of world we want. Would any of the other panelists like to jump in and talk about some of the challenges they faced organizing under COVID? Maybe NeeNee or Medea? You're muted. Everyone is muted. You're unmuted.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right, that's great. I have a little dog here, so
I have a cat.
That's
why I have no picture behind me. My cat knocked it off. I had a nice picture behind me, and somehow the cat managed to pull a framed picture off the wall by jumping on it. I have no idea how that could happen, but yes, I relate to your dog.
Yeah. So, Sean spoke about, he dropped jewels because basically a lot of the things he was saying is true when it comes to protesting, especially here in DC. But the reality is, one of the disadvantages is just being Black. And that's real here in DC, everywhere. Like right now, with my friends, my comrades in Minnesota, they I was like sad when I saw Unicorn Riot. They were videoing them and they like, "We got our hands up, we unarmed. We got our hands up, we unarmed." For us to have to say that, because I've come to a term where my hands are not up and don't shoot. That's out of my vocabulary now. I'm not even speaking that into existence anymore. My hands are up and I'm fighting back. So that's where I'm at when it comes to resistance. And the reality is, I'm here in DC. Like I just said, just being Black. Like we literally just did a essentially not expandable caravan, and we had go-go music playing because that's what DC is known for. And we were social distancing and we were like celebrating the essential workers. And the police came, no PPE. They telling us that, we not following protocols, but they show up with no PPE. And then I'm looking on Facebook where we got white people having a jazz band playing in front of the police station. I'm like, what's really going on here, So protesting while being Black is a disadvantage, period, because of the color of our skin. And secondly, just trying to move around the city, because of the things that we fight for. Capitalism capitalism and imperialism don't want to go anywhere. And those are things that we resist and we try to dismantle. So as soon as we start doing that, we get shut down. Just like, we had a big shut it down DC rally, and the only people that got locked up was Black Lives Matter. Our block our coalition was the only one who got locked up, and we had white people on top of ships and chained to cars, and we just had our signs in the middle of the street. And we were the ones that got locked up. So it's the challenge is just trying to protest and have your concerns. It's really Black. And just like now, my friends took a Black Day because it's emotionally drained for being treated the way we were, but just trying to raise concerns over a Black man who couldn't breathe. And it's a lot. Like, I was going to cancel today because there is so much that we're holding, and we just wanted to stop. But even when we try to protest for it to stop, we get oppressed. So it's a lot. So I would actually say just being Black is a problem trying to protest.
Thank you. That was very, very powerful. Medea, you've been organizing. I also was asked to remind people watching online on our website that they can click the little hand button on the right to ask a question during Q&A, and someone will get that question to me. Medea, what sort of challenges have you faced while protesting during COVID, and how have you gotten around them?
We do a lot of our protests inside the halls of Congress, and we can't do that now. We do a lot of our protests at the offices of many of the agencies in DC that are closed down now, with the people working from home. We have a hard time even contacting individual Congress people because most of them are in their districts. And so what we've done is gone to the districts. And that has been a good organizing exercise for us to try to be more local and grassroots. I'm in Miami, and 2 days ago we went to the home of Senator Marco Rubio. And it was a tough thing here because people in Miami are not used to doing that. And they said, it's not nice to go to his home. And so we had to kind of push and say, this is not about being nice. This is about being effective right now. He's not going to his office. How are you going to get his attention? Then there's issues, you know, after seeing what happened in Minneapolis, it changes my mind a lot about organizing, because before that, I was very conflicted, also thinking that we have to be careful. Socially responsible means not getting a lot of people out, being mindful of social distancing, wearing masks. And then you see this kind of murder and people spontaneously come out to the streets. And I'm so glad they're out, and I wish I was there out with them. And a lot of this other mindfulness kind of goes by the wayside when things are so immediate and dire. And the way Mara said that we're in a time of great uncertainty and we have to be flexible. I think what the people are doing in the streets of Minneapolis, you know, are showing what it means to be flexible and be immediate, to voice the outrage. Some of the other things that we're facing, well, we have to also be mindful that there are people who have pre-existing conditions, people who are older, who don't feel comfortable going out unless it's in a controlled kind of space. And we say, yes, we're going to have a controlled space, and then we get out there and it's not controlled because other people don't feel the same kind of need. They're not wearing masks. They're not social distancing. And so it's hard to control sometimes our own people. And, you know, people are just, they have different levels of feeling safe or not safe. And that's a hard thing to control. We've had called for caravans, and people say, well, we don't have cars. And so that's an issue. And in one of the protests we did recently, we had some people in cars, some people in bikes, and some people walking. And that was a way to, you know, get around that and also continue to be 6 feet apart and socially distanced, responsible. We've done a lot of banner hangs. That's something that people feel comfortable doing. I think a lot of the visual protests, like putting the body bags out in front of the White House, have been very good examples. The media is looking for things. Supporting the protests of the healthcare workers has been a great thing to do, and they've been very organized and trying to keep people really separate and wanting to be a good example. If they're out there protesting for more protection, they've got to make sure that the protest is done in a way that reflects that. So it's a different world. We don't know where this is going, but I think people are feeling like they want to start getting out. And I know that the protests we've done recently, we've had people be so thankful for giving them a way to get out, to voice their opposition for whatever the issue is. But we've been trying to do it in a way where they feel safe.
Thank you for that, Medea. Chinyere, do you want to talk about some of the protest work you've been doing and the challenges faced and how you've sort of adopted to this time of COVID?
Yeah, so thank you all for having me.
Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, so my name is Medea. I am the co-founder and co-director or director of the BlackOUT Collective. We are a Black direct action organization. I think that and work within like community groups all over the country and then a few national networks. I think initially there was a lot of questions that we received on like, what does this look like and what does it mean? Not necessarily a lot of like requests for support for actions. I think that as time has shifted, in particularly around rent, so the first kind of up wave that we saw was in April, around April 1st, and people trying to figure out, well, what is our response to rent? What does that mean? What does that look like? And you saw a lot of really careful social distance actions globally. Right? You saw people being really clear around whether it was taping spaces that you saw in, I think it was in Jerusalem, or you saw cars or people banging on doors and banging, doing the kasala, I'm not going to say that correctly, so I won't, banging pots and pans, right? Like using noise as form of action. Were some of the things that we saw pretty early and people using as tactics. And as time has moved, there's definitely been a lot. I know that there were several groups that we worked with and supported around Medea, being able to move and get on the streets. I do think that we're at a point after in particularly seeing the lack of response to right-wing protesters in a lot of May and April, and then being able to see the stark contrast, which many of us, many Black people in particular, knew was there, but seeing it visibly, combined with heat and restlessness, I do think that there are a lot of folks that are poised to take action in different ways in this moment. And one of the things that we're struggling with as an organization that supports groups, helps structure national cause, who does kind of that role, is like, how do we do that in a way that definitely does not tell people to not take the streets, but how do we encourage safety if it's possible, right? What does harm mitigation look like? Understanding that that's the approach that we have to take, because people do have a level of agency, and understanding at what point does it become more dangerous to be in the streets and worrying about getting COVID than knowing that somebody could shoot you or have your life in danger from going to the park, right? Like there are various circumstances where people are in those consistently in this moment, really thinking about what does harm mitigation and what does risk look like, and how do you manage that? So those are some of the conversations when thinking about actions currently that I've been in like swirls around. And then also really thinking about trying to think forward around like, well, what does it look like as we're doing this now, knowing that things may shift, things will open up, they may have to close back down. How are we preparing even people to be able to go back to other ways? So using digital tools has also been something that we've been teaching people in ways that I would not have defined as actions previously, that we are expanding that, right? So being able to do Twitter storms, going back to old school tactics of just calling people and doing call storms, like these things are actually really important because of various risks. So in ways that we would do any kind of march or strategic tactical action where people are using harnesses or any of that, we always think of like, how can the most amount of people really participate and define their risk for themselves? It's those same principles that have to be in play now. So we know that there are people who are at different levels of risk, so how do we continue to give access points for them to participate, to be able to push back, to be able to organize, and how for those who are at a different level of risk are willing to take more risk, which at this point means going outside and doing action. Like that's the risk that we're talking about, not necessarily talking about risk of arrest, which under other circumstances would be how we are thinking about risk, but really risk of virus. Then we allow and create spaces so that people can mitigate that and judge that for themselves.
Thank you so much for all the points. And for the final perspective, before we move into questions, I'm going to get a slightly different perspective, I think. Tyler, you're a legal observer. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is, and what are sort of some of the challenges for legal observing during COVID? You are still muted. I apologize. I did not. I unmuted all of the panelists but you. That was not intentional. I promise. Okay.
Hey, thank you, Chip. So, one thing I'll say is the National Lawyers Guild, we're the oldest people's law organization in the United States. So with that, one thing we realize is that we don't have a justice system in America. What we have is a legal system that is designed and formed to protect white supremacy and capitalism. The officer who murdered George Floyd, he's not going to be dragged into court bruised and battered like the way a black man would be if he was accused of even the most minor crime. And the reason why that's important for us to, use as a part of our political grounding in the work we do is that, a lot of people have this Atticus Finch style image of the way the legal system works and the way public interest lawyering works. But here at the Guild, we're always going to follow grassroots movements. We're always going to follow people's movements instead of trying to direct them. Our role is to identify those movements and not to make a judgment or a call or an evaluation of the tactics or the strategies they're using, but to just figure out ways to further their goals. That's why anytime you see a movement like this, just like in Minneapolis, you're always going to see National Lawyers Guild legal observers on the ground in their neon green hats, being there to make sure that we have a way to keep law enforcement in check as best as we can. So right now, the biggest practical challenges we're facing during this period are just getting people out there safely and responsibly. We know that a lot of protests have taken place in this country that are extremely irresponsible protests that have been led by right-wing activists. And that's something we never want the public who we're committed to winning over to our causes to ever see us in that light, which is why, the Guild, we always see that there's a need for us to be in the streets when there's an uprising taking place, when there's a protest movement taking place, but we're always going to do that safely. Right now, we have national protocols to make sure that our legal observers are doing that safely. We're following all the guidelines on social distancing. All of our legal observers are using masks, and we're sort of evaluating on a case-by-case basis. And so we have continued to do this work, and we're continuing to figure out ways to keep up with movements and to be as creative as they are in order to make sure that we're getting the best possible legal support that we can to those activists, knowing that in a lot of ways the justice system will fail us in the long run as we try to defend these movements, because it will often side with the forces we're resisting. But we're still going to do everything we can to be out there on the streets with activists, and we're going to fight like hell just like they do.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to audience questions, but I see Medea actually sent a question to the panelists, and I'm wondering if she would like to ask it. Do I have to unmute you again? Okay, I have to unmute you every time you remute yourself. That is a lesson.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I have a question about the issue of police wearing masks. I've seen that at some of our protests, police are wearing masks. At another one, the police came right up to us without masks and started yelling in our faces. And we felt very unsafe by that. So is this something that varies city by city, state by state? Is there any challenge we can do to get police to have to wear masks?
Well, we've encountered that, and I know that this happens all over the country, and there isn't obviously a rule, and it's completely varied because every jurisdiction has its own rules about mandatory masks or not mandatory masks, or can you wear masks if you stay 6 feet away, or do you have to, or don't you have to? And of course, we have a president in office that is saying that, wearing masks is political correctness. So, right now, the whole issue of masks is all over the place. And there isn't a hard and fast rule. But what we've done and what we encourage people to do is when you're at an activity, if you're outside, for example, this happened at the Cancel the Rent protests in DC that we were talking about earlier. The police showed up in the parking lot for, again, this peaceful car caravan that was going to the mayor's house, to the White House, to DC jail. And we had DC police, park police, Secret Service, multiple cars, unmarked cars, all of them showed up in the parking lot. And then all of the police got out and talked to each other, none of them wearing masks. And then they came over to us and wanted to know what was going on. And the first thing we said is, you have a mask, go put it on. And they turned around and they went and got their masks. And we had people take out their phones. And so I think it's really important, if you see police officers who are coming up and around your activities and they don't have masks on, you absolutely should be videotaping them and videotaping yourself or someone else demanding that they put on masks. If they're in your face, you should be saying, this is not safe, you're endangering public health, I'm asking you to step back, and you just say it over and over again and step back yourself, because you don't want to have your health endangered by, you know, law enforcement officers who may be following the Trump rule on wearing masks.
Thank you very much, Mara. One question we got from the audience for Tyler is, how does one request a National Lawyers Guild legal observer?
Well, to request a National Lawyers Guild legal observer, you can always contact our national office at massdef, MASSDEF @NLG.org, and we'll always connect you to your local chapter, or you can always find your local chapter in your city, and they will always be able to find legal support for you.
Okay, and then another question we have is, does anyone have connection to tips or guides for safe ways to educate and involve youth in protesting? And there's a couple of questions that have a similar. Yes.
We did a tip sheet for social distance protests and actions that I'm happy to share here. If you give me a minute, I'll put it in the chat, or something that may be able to be sent out. It's not specifically for young people, this one isn't, but it is super friendly and like easy to read kind of infographic that outlines a couple of different tactics and how to do it to be able to share with communities.
Sure. And there was a second question that also was about how to get young people to protest as well. So that is two audience members have that question. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that. And we will share that resource. We will email all of the participants of the day and include that.
I just want to say, the young people or getting young people to protest, actually, you know, the last couple of years, when you look at the climate movement, young people are leading the way. So young people are out in the streets for sure. And, you know, you see a true racial justice movement. So I think really some of what we have to be asking ourselves and what's important is see what young people are protesting and go join them.
I like that, Mar. I like that. And that's a good segue, because our next question is from Eleanor on Facebook, and it's for you. If someone gets arrested, harassed by police, what steps should they take? Go to court, file a claim against the police department?
I think it depends on the nature of what happens and where you are. Most cities or jurisdictions have some type of complaint process. Our experience with those complaint processes is they are virtually worthless because they don't have authority or subpoena power over the police. The civilian review boards really lack teeth in most places. If you are in a place where that's different and you have true community control over police, which I would say is rare to never, then you might have a mechanism. But I think the main thing to do is, if you're suffering harassment, if you've suffered abuse, if you've suffered a violation of civil rights, you want to document it. If you can document it while it's happening, people always forget in the moment when something's happening with a police officer. If you can, try and get that officer's badge number, their name. Like, we don't think about that when something's happening to us, but if we can, it's really important to try and do that. And then get yourself to a civil rights lawyer who can talk to you about whether or not you can, you know, have a redress for what happened, whether you can vindicate your constitutional rights in court. I mean, the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, that's what we've done. We've done class action lawsuits all over the country and defended activists and organizations and really fought to try and change the laws and the handling of police protests, as well as getting damages for protesters whose rights have been violated. So I think it just always depends on what the nature of the encounter is.
So Mara, that's a really good segue, because somebody else has brought up online that police officers, they say, oftentimes conceal their badge numbers, making the only way to identify them by recognizing a face. If officers are wearing face masks, this becomes very difficult. Are there any suggestions for how to identify officers in that situation? And that might be beyond the scope of this panel. I don't know.
Try and get all the pictures you can and all the identification you possibly can. If they have police cars, try and get their plate numbers. You might have a way of tracking back who was on patrol or at the location and be able to identify them later with as much as you possibly have at hand. But for example, in Washington, D.C., we had that problem for years. We had the police actually taking black tape and covering their badge numbers and their IDs. So as part of one of the lawsuits that we brought about mass false arrest and brutality against demonstrators, where we were representing more than 1,000 people who had been brutally arrested and brutalized. But one of the outcomes of that was that in DC, there's actually a law that requires enhanced identification in the context of First Amendment policing. So the police actually have to not only make sure that their IDs are visible, but they have to wear enhanced IDs. So if they put on riot gear, they have to wear enhanced IDs outside the riot gear. And actually the law has serious restrictions on when they can even ever put on riot gear. So that's another thing. If you're having that problem repeatedly, please document it and get it to the social justice lawyers in your jurisdiction, because if you have multiple people documenting the police concealing their badges, then people can take action to change that.
That's a really, really good point. So we have a question from Lynn for any of the panelists. On our feet protest affected with social distancing means we are more spread out. I worry that makes protesters more vulnerable to anti-protest violence or police efforts to divide and suppress. Any ideas to counter those things?
Let me answer.
Sure.
The reality is that that's not going. It's kind of impossible to social distance and go to the streets. Even when we did our Caravan and we got out at the Safeway parking lot, you know, we encouraged people. We gave out face masks and hand sanitizer, and we encouraged people to stand by their cars while the go-go band, which we only let 3 players play in the band because we needed social distancing, but we needed that go-go beat. But it was kind of impossible when people actually come to the street to actually social distance. And especially like right now, like we struggling not to take to the streets right now, even like with all the deaths that's going on and trying to stand in solidarity with our family members in Minneapolis and in Louisville. And just here in DC, where DC police are so bored right now that they're terrorizing, harassing, and I mean, just being disrespectful to Black people in marginalized neighborhoods. So right now, we've had 2 fights where Black people have just said, no, you're not gonna hit me, and have retaliated fighting a police officer. Straight up hands, no guns. So I literally had to put a message out today that, hey, look, you guys can't rev up, because if you amp up the police, Black Lives Matter coming to the streets. And it's just that you can't stay in silence, because silence is consent. And liberation, we're gonna do whatever we do. So the reality is that when we go to those streets, like right now, like they just gotta be blessed to stay safe, but to sit in the house is not gonna solve the problem. We just gotta break ancestors and keep us in. It's at a time that we have to rise up and fight back, because with Trump, the way he's showing up, it's just gonna get worse if we just stay silent. So the only thing I would recommend is that, yeah, because if you stay separate, you can get grabbed. I know definitely I'm not gonna be not by myself. My person gotta be, my tribe member gotta be more so like 3 feet from me, because I don't wanna get snatched. Because if somebody gets snatched, we snatch them back. So it's kind of dangerous. So I wouldn't even recommend to try. I mean, you can tell people to do it, but it's a risk. Just like BlackOUT conference had said, it's a risk you take going into the streets right now because it's too dangerous to social distance, especially when you're rising up. It's too dangerous to social distance because someone can get seriously hurt by a violent or racist cop.
Any other perspectives on that? Medea, you want to go?
Yeah, I think if you have a relatively small protest, one thing that I've seen that has worked is having a rope where you tie the knot every 6 feet and people take hold on to the knots, and you feel like you've got people, with you because you're all together on this rope, but you're still socially distanced. And then you have one in back of that and one in back of that.
It's very creative.
And also when people are marching with banners and banners are 6+ feet wide and you have people on either end of a banner, you are naturally socially distant.
Yes, I can relate to that because one time at a protest, I went to get the DSA banner and I grabbed like this super big one that no one could hold, and it was a calamity. So my boss, Sue, has asked me, and since she's my boss, I have to do so, to give a shout out to Beautiful Trouble because they have an irreverent guide, she says, to activism in the time of pandemic called Holy S****. I don't know what those letters, those asterisks could be concealing. 7 things you can do besides hoarding toilet paper. So that is something to be on the lookout for. And then, so here's an interesting question. Would honking be equivalent to amplified speech?
So the honking question and the sound question is really an interesting one, actually. So there's the issue of amplified sound, right? So when you're speaking and you're using a bullhorn, some jurisdictions require you to have a sound permit. If you are broadcasting sound, if you're using speakers or bullhorns, it actually depends on the jurisdiction whether or not it applies to bullhorns or only to speakers at a certain decibel level. And then there's the issue of honking. And there are some that would, might argue that if you're honking because you're honking for a matter of, to make a point, that's First Amendment protected. I think that's unsteady ground to rely on, that honking is exactly the same as verbal expression. But a lot of organizers who've been doing cancel the rent protests and other car caravan and to ICE and decarceration have been using really, really clever mechanisms of having people use their car stereos, have them all linked in through either a Zoom or some other mechanism where they're simultaneously playing the same chanting or the same speeches or whatever the message is. And I think that's where you have a really interesting issue, because if the police are going to come and say, well, you don't have a sound permit, but again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. So you don't have a sound permit, but they don't require a sound permit for car radios. And that was actually something that we addressed, again, when we were dealing with the police trying to stop folks being in the parking lot about a sound permit. They're not going to stop people from playing car radios. They can't have a different standard for sound in the context of a demonstration.
So someone has asked Mara if you could please talk more about the right to videotape the police.
You have a First Amendment right to videotape the police, you just do. And where the issue will come into play is the police will say, well, your videotaping is interfering with the police function. So they can order people to step back, but the police don't always recognize that you have a First Amendment right to videotape, but you do. So you always have the right to videotape police encounters, your own and others. The thing that we would tell people is if you're in a car, you obviously want to make sure, even though, well, it's completely lawful to be videotaping, that you're not doing something that the police are going to use as a basis to shoot you. So there are the real practical considerations that come into play. If you're out on the street and you see the police assaulting someone, or you're having your own issues with the police, you have the right to videotape them. You may need to move so that they can't claim that you are interfering, but you absolutely have that right.
So Medea has asked in the chat box, and I can read it, or you can ask it yourself, Medea, whichever one you prefer. What do people think about getting a permit for a car caravan protest? I see laughter.
Well, if if you wanted to, you don't need a permit for a car protest if you're following the traffic rules. If it's that you want to be able to go through lights and have exclusive access to the streets in a particular way, then that's where you would possibly try and get the permit, because you're not going to be running a bunch of cars through red lights. But otherwise, you don't require one.
Excellent.
Can I speak? Because I would have to disagree. Because I literally have done like 4 or 5 car caravans and ran lights. It's against the law. Yeah, it is. But that's what resistance look like. And actually, we just tell people to stay together. And reality is, and we have marshals to like block the intersections, because it's a way of resistance and protesting. So the reality is, getting a permit is like getting permission, and it's hypocrisy for us to go like, hey, we need this permit because we want you to let people out of jails. We need you to release our loved ones out of prisons. So no, we didn't get permits for none of our protesters. And we ran lights, and what happened was, we just told people we were going to run the lights, and if anyone get a ticket, to please send your tickets to Black Lives Matter DC, and we'll pay for your ticket. And none of the times did the police mess with us. Actually, the police saw us just like if he was in a walk-in protest, and they literally tried to stop the traffic and try to see where we're going to stop the traffic so that we can keep going. But we didn't ask for their assistance, but they did try to stop the traffic for us.
Well, I think what you're saying is really important, and what we should contextualize too to DC and other jurisdictions. Like in DC, there actually is no permit requirement for taking the streets for protesting in Washington. And actually, as a consequence of the lawsuits we brought, we got that eliminated. So the police cannot arrest you in Washington for parading without a permit. So it's actually brilliant to have in DC people physically blocking the intersections and then the cars taking advantage. But I think we do recognize that some people who may be in vulnerable communities, people that are protesting at the ICE detention centers, folks that are doing those car caravans, they can't risk getting stopped or arrested or detained because we don't know if they're undocumented. There may be a lot of reasons why people have to do different things in different ways.
So someone explicitly asked the question, undocumented people can protest, but they're a greater risk, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that should have agency over how they choose their risk. And that no matter what kind of actions they're choosing, the group and individuals get to decide the level of risk. I know lots of undocumented people who have done wildly courageous and amazing forms of direct action that put them in positions of actually being arrested or got really close because that was the risk that they chose for themselves in that moment. So it's definitely possible.
Sure. Any other thoughts on risk or the car protest question or the question of undocumented protests? I know that's 3 related but separate issues, but I want to give everyone a chance to jump in who wants to talk.
Well, I wonder how much people have faced counter protests so far, because the issue of the police permit came up when a group was afraid that they would be, even in their car caravan, that they would be confronted. So I don't know how much that has happened, if anybody in this group has seen that yet and how to deal with that.
I haven't seen it yet or some of the people that we are in our network or our community. Also, I think it depends on how public the actual action is previous, right? Is it mass in the sense that you are publicizing it on Facebook and social media or in other spaces, or is it within a particular organized group already? I think will determine the risk of, and obviously your community, of whether or not you'll get counter protests, but I haven't seen it.
Sure. That's a good point. A big thing we're getting a lot of questions about, multiple ones, is protecting the anonymity of protesters. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? or is that even possible?
I'm sorry, you said the what of protesters?
And anonymity, keeping protesters anonymous to avoid doxing or police retaliation or those types of things. I know a lot of people are afraid of being doxed by the alt-right or police retaliation. Those are two real fears that are only getting worse.
Yeah, under normal circumstances, participating in actions with your face covered, that would try to protect your anonymity depending on where you're at and who you are, is actually a significantly more dangerous and puts you at a higher risk of police altercations or other things than like really trying to figure out the balance between that and wondering around retaliation from the right. I think that in some of the larger cities, it is less of an issue. I imagine in some smaller communities where people know each other, it's just a little smaller in that space, and that the community itself might be a little bit more conservative, that can become a concern. And to me, then again, I think it's possible now that we have to go out with, or at least in certain spaces, with face masks, and there are ways that you can use the cars. I think car caravans can give actually a great opportunity for anonymity. And then would also go back to really looking at your risk mitigation and why are you out there? What are you risking? Is it worth the risk for you? And being able to either decide to do something else that is less risky of an action, or being able to really step out and step in there knowing that there are lots of people who face levels of harm and risk on a daily basis and don't have those same choices. But it is one of the, for me, like really thinking about this question of mitigating risk and understanding all the different factors in it. And there's no one size fits all answer to that question when looking at participating in actions.
So we've got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask a closing question of all of the panelists, and I'm going to ask you to be mindful of the fact that there are, I'm not good at math, many of you, and 5 minutes. And this question is, why is the right to protest important to you? Don't all jump in at once.
Real quick.
Yeah.
The right to protest is important to me because it's the sharpest weapon that people collectively have, because we don't have the power and money and resources and all these sorts of things that the government does and all these other big institutions. So our ability to organize is our sharpest weapon, if you will. So that's the strongest thing for me. And we're in a very difficult time, but if you look at all the different movements throughout history, they were able to be victorious because they dared to struggle and therefore dared to win. And look forward to seeing folks this weekend at our next car caravan at canceltherents.org.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in. The right to protest to me is important to me because Harriet Tubman had to do it under the Underground Railroad and go through the woods to set my people free. So I walk on top of the track, being unapologetically black, using my voice and my weapon to get my people free.
Excellent. Who wants to go next? Nick.
No, just to say, we work all around the world, and we live in this global era of protest, and we just see movement after movement in country after country of people challenging power and having their voice heard. And there's setbacks, but there's also just a lot of success, right? And it's one of the most effective tools you can use to have your voice heard and change society. And we see that in country after country.
Chinyere, do you want to go next?
Yeah. So it's important to me. The First Amendment is one of my, if I had to choose one, it is what I've decided to devote my life to, right? And being able to do so because I come from a line of people who weren't, and who found ways to be in action and be in struggle towards freedom in so many small ways that were deemed illegal, that it is vital for me to pick up that organize, and to be able to be in action collectively with people. It's a responsibility.
Thank you. Medea.
I think it was Alice Walker said that activism is the rent we pay for living on this planet. And also Mara said it's socially irresponsible not to protest. I agree with that. And I also think, just from a personal privilege point, to not lose our sense of humanity when we see what happened to Mr. Floyd, to not think I'm going to get out on the streets and show how disgusted I am about that. We have to, even just from that very personal point, hold on to our right to protest as a way to not let go of our sense of community and our sense of morality.
Tyler?
I would say the right to protest to me is important because, you know, in these times we have so many challenges. There's so much to despair about. There's so much to worry about. But when I see people in the streets, when I see people organizing, when I see people fighting back, it gives me hope. So that's why protest is important to me.
And last but not least, Mara.
I think, speaking on behalf of our organization, on behalf of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, the whole focus of our work when it comes to the First Amendment right arena and the focus on the rights of people to be in the streets is the understanding that, looking at the United States, the country in which we live and the country in which we struggle, that all social change for the better that has occurred in this country has occurred because people were in the streets. Labor rights were won because people were in the streets. Suffrage, the end to Jim Crow apartheid, the Vietnam War era, LGBTQ rights, everything has occurred that we cherish because people fought in the streets for those rights and for those fundamental rights. And as I was saying before, right now, we are at an incredible inflection point in our society, and everything we do right now matters. So for us, we want to do everything we can to keep the streets and the sidewalks open for protest, for democracy, for social change, because it does matter what we do. And this is the way that collectively we can all make the difference that we want.
Thank you for that. And I will give what I want to, why the protest is important to me. Defending Rights Dissent, one of the things we say is that, you know, the right to assemble, the right to engage in collective action, the right to free speech, these are fundamental rights, but they're not just fundamental rights, they're tools. They're the tools by which we fight for and build a better world, and the tools by which we achieve social change. And that is why the right to protest is important to me. I want to thank all of our panelists tonight, and I want to thank everyone who's joining us at home. This webinar on socially responsible protest organizing during COVID was brought to you by Greenpeace, the National Lawyers Guild, Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University School of Law, Uncoke My Campus, Piper Fund, Common Cause, Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, Palestine Legal, BlackOUT Collective, PEN America, and of course, my organization, Defending Rights and Dissent. Thank you for joining us. It was a very, very good conversation we had tonight.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, y'all.